A flight attendant mocked a Navy SEAL mid-flight. Seconds later, he was saluting him without even knowing why, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He mocked a quiet passenger, laughing at scars he didn't understand. Subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not demanded. Jace Ryland was halfway down the narrow aisle of the crowded plane when the words hit him. "Got a tough guy in coach," the flight attendant muttered, not even trying to hide the smirk as he elbowed the crew member beside him. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried just enough to land with weight. The two chuckled quietly, sharing that smug, knowing look of people who thought they had power simply because others couldn't respond. Jace paused, his boot hovering an inch above the floor before settling down silently. He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge the comment. He simply adjusted the strap of his worn duffel bag and kept walking, past the murmurs, past the sideways glances of boarding passengers, past the staleness of recycled air and coffee-stained carpets. He found row 34, midsection, window seat, 34B, right where it said on his boarding pass. He slid in without a word, ducking under the overhead compartment. As he lowered himself into the seat, the familiar creak of old joints reminded him that peace came at a cost. Years of missions, shattered nights, and things that would never be printed in a newspaper had carved a silent weight into his bones. But here, on this plane, he was just a man in a hoodie, a cap, and jeans. Civilian. Invisible. Or so he hoped. Chandler Vex, the same flight attendant who had made the remark, remained a few rows up, taking his time with a half-hearted seatbelt demonstration while flashing artificial smiles at the passengers in business class. Occasionally, he threw a glance over his shoulder, eyes narrowing as they locked briefly with Jace's. Chandler looked away quickly, adjusting his tie, but not before Jace saw it, that little flicker of insecurity behind the mask. Jace leaned back into his seat and exhaled quietly, letting the ambient noise of the cabin swallow his thoughts. He didn't come here looking for trouble. He came for quiet, for routine, the kind of uneventful silence that had become foreign after years of chaos. But chaos had a funny way of finding him, even in aisle 34 of a commercial aircraft. A boy 2 rows ahead sneezed. A man across the aisle grunted about legroom. The engines hummed low and steady, preparing for pushback. Jace closed his eyes for a second, tuning out the noise, grounding himself. Breathe in, count 4. Breathe out, count 6. The rhythm that had once steadied his pulse during firefights now helped him sit still in coach. But behind his stillness was a mind in motion. He'd seen men like Chandler before, men who mistook kindness for weakness, who picked targets by reading faces they assumed wouldn't fight back. Jace had been trained not to react, not unless the threat was real. And Chandler Vex, for now, was just noise. But noise could become a distraction, and distractions could get people hurt. The plane jolted slightly as it was towed from the gate. Jace felt the vibration through the metal frame beneath his feet. The view outside the window was washed in morning sunlight, bright but pale, the kind of light that made everything look clean and false. It didn't match how he felt inside. Something was off. As the safety briefing continued, Chandler's voice returned, slightly louder now, almost performative. "Please fasten your seatbelts unless you're planning to jump out midair," which, for some of us, he glanced again toward the back of the plane, might actually be an improvement. A few chuckles rose from passengers, not out of amusement but discomfort. Jace didn't move, but his jaw tightened slightly. He thought about his last mission, the heat of Vandal Province, the silence before breaching a compound that held 23 hostages, the memory of sand clinging to sweat and blood. He had seen men scream orders with shaking hands, and he had seen others whisper into radios with calm precision while chaos burned around them. He knew the difference. Chandler didn't. Jace's fingers curled loosely around the seatbelt strap. Not in anger, not even in tension. Just readiness. Always readiness. The cabin dimmed slightly as the plane turned, aligning with the runway. The engines whined louder. A child cried in the back. Somewhere to his left, a phone vibrated against a tray table. And then, quiet. For a moment, just as the plane began its takeoff roll, Jace looked out the window and let his mind drift. To the sea. To a memory of a coastline where he'd once sat beside his unit, laughing over cold rations and warm beer. Back when he still believed in an off switch. Back when men didn't laugh at ghosts because they didn't yet carry any. The plane lifted off. The city fell away behind him. And yet, the war had somehow boarded with him. Chandler passed again down the aisle, pushing the service cart. As he drew near, his smile returned, but this time it was different. Sharper. Aimed. He leaned slightly toward Jace's row and said with a mock cheerful tone, "Hope you're comfortable back here, sir." Should be a quiet flight, unless you're expecting some action. It was meant to provoke, to tease, maybe even to embarrass. Jace turned his head slowly, meeting Chandler's eyes with the stillness of a deep ocean. "No expectations," he said evenly, "just observation." Chandler blinked, the smile wavering for half a second before he wheeled the cart forward, muttering something under his breath. The moment passed, but something had shifted. The tension wasn't loud, it didn't scream, it simmered, like the faint ticking of a timed charge no one had noticed yet. A few passengers glanced around uneasily, sensing something they couldn't explain. And somewhere deep inside, Jace knew this wasn't just a bad service encounter. This was the first move in a pattern. He didn't know when the next would come, but it would. And when it did, he'd be ready. Because sometimes the battlefield doesn't knock. It boards quietly and smiles. And when that happens, only a soldier knows what to listen for. He just sat down. The first shot had been fired, but no one realized a war was quietly beginning. Sometimes the battlefield finds you when you've left it behind. Chandler Vex leaned in with a forced cough, loud and theatrical. "Sir, I hope you're not bringing any covert ops diseases on board," he said with an exaggerated bow. His voice dipped in mock seriousness, like a stage actor performing for an unwilling crowd. A few passengers nearby let out awkward chuckles, unsure if they were laughing out of amusement or second-hand discomfort. The moment hovered uncomfortably in the air. Jace Ryland didn't flinch. He merely looked up, his face unreadable, expression calm. His eyes, however, locked onto Chandler's like twin scopes locking in on a target. "Noted," he said, his tone flat but clear, the kind of response that carried weight not in volume, but in precision. Chandler blinked. He'd expected a scowl, maybe even a rebuke. What he got instead was silence. Controlled, practiced, dangerous silence. For a moment, it unsettled him, but then he forced a smirk back onto his face and sauntered off toward the front galley, already preparing his next little show. Minutes later, the food and beverage cart made its way down the aisle with the subtle squeal of rubber wheels over aging airplane carpet. Chandler was back at it, now armed with an arsenal of drinks and, more importantly, an audience. He stopped beside Jace's row with a loud sigh and placed a small apple juice box on the tray table in front of him. Bright red, covered in cartoon characters, a grinning seal in a captain's hat, no less. "Something for the soldier boy," Chandler announced, his grin sharp as glass. A few passengers chuckled again, more boldly this time. One man across the aisle shook his head and whispered something to his seatmate. Another woman turned slightly in her seat, just enough to watch but not enough to intervene. Jace looked at the juice box, then at Chandler. His gaze didn't falter. He picked up the box, turned it slowly in his hand, and nodded once. "Thanks," he said evenly. Chandler, expecting a different reaction, hesitated. There was no anger, no flash of irritation, not even a flicker of pride wounded, just acknowledgement. It threw him off balance, though he covered it with a shrug and rolled the cart forward. Behind the stillness of Jace's posture, something deeper stirred. His mind, ever disciplined, mapped the situation. This wasn't a battlefield, but it didn't need to be. There were patterns in behavior, movements, tones, glances. Chandler's arrogance wasn't spontaneous. It was habit. His need to provoke, to mock, to perform, revealed something critical. He felt safe around people he thought were beneath him, safe enough to try and humiliate strangers in public with no fear of consequence, safe enough to underestimate the one man in the room most capable of ending that comfort with a whisper. Jace sipped from the juice box. It was warm, overly sweet, almost artificial. He didn't care. It wasn't about the drink. It was about the measure of a man, and Chandler had just handed him a compass. From his seat, Jace observed with quiet precision. Chandler continued down the aisle, cracking jokes with passengers, flirting lightly with a man in 22A, ignoring a father asking for extra napkins. It was all showmanship, a desperate kind, like a stage actor trying to steal the spotlight from a play he didn't understand. Cocky. Untested. Reckless, Jace thought. Words his old team used to mark liabilities in the field. But this wasn't the field. This was a confined, pressurized cabin, 30,000 feet in the air, filled with people who had no idea how close their lives were to being in the hands of the unprepared. And that, more than the insult, bothered Jace. He leaned back in his seat, eyes closed but ears open. The sounds around him folded into layers, the hum of the engine, the rhythmic shuffle of shoes, the rustle of snack bags, and Chandler's voice, somewhere behind, still mocking. "Probably played Call of Duty once and thinks he's Black Ops," Chandler muttered near the rear galley. Jace's jaw tightened slightly, just for a moment. Not from offense, but from focus. There was a time, not long ago, when insults could cost men their lives. In the desert, in the jungle, on foreign streets where children held radios and motorbikes hid bombs, and while this wasn't that place, the principle remained. Disrespect left unchecked turned into decay, and decay, in leadership or service, became danger. Still, Jace didn't move, didn't react. He simply watched, calculated, assessed. From the back row, a teenager looked forward curiously, tall, awkward, with a mop of sandy brown hair. He'd noticed it too. The juice box, the laughter, the way the quiet man didn't flinch. Felix drawn. But Jace didn't see him. Not yet. The plane's lights dimmed slightly, transitioning to in-flight mode. The hush that followed was false, temporary, like a ceasefire in hostile territory. Chandler passed by again. No comments this time. Just a glance. But Jace saw it, the flicker of doubt behind the smirk. A seed had been planted. Jace reached down and unzipped his duffel just enough to slide the juice box inside. A strange trophy. A reminder, not of humiliation, but of patience, of restraint. And in his mind, he began preparing for what might come next, not out of paranoia, but out of habit. A soldier doesn't wait to be struck. He reads the terrain, and Chandler Vex had just declared himself unstable terrain. The pressure in the cabin adjusted slightly as the plane reached cruising altitude. A soft chime rang out. Seatbelt lights turned off, and Jace Ryland opened his eyes. Respect isn't given, he thought again, slower this time. But disrespect always has a cost. And someone, very soon, was going to pay it. "Someone's seen too many action movies," Chandler Vex said as he passed row 34, his voice coated in mockery. "Or maybe he's waiting to wrestle a hijacker midair." The words floated loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, followed by a short burst of awkward laughter from a businessman across the aisle. The joke landed weakly, but Chandler didn't care. He wasn't aiming for comedy, he was aiming for control. He tossed the comment over his shoulder like a grenade, walking on as if he hadn't just humiliated someone. Jace Ryland didn't turn around. He didn't blink. He simply stared ahead, hands folded over his lap, knuckles faintly tight. The line between patience and fury was thinner than most people realized, but for Jace, it was a battlefield he had trained his entire life to master. Behind him, in seat 35A, 16-year-old Felix Drawn tensed. He had noticed the first comment when Jace boarded, then the juice box incident, then the snide coughing performance. But this one felt different. He leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowed, watching the back of Jace's head as if it might reveal the man's thoughts. Felix didn't know who Jace was, but something in his gut told him that the silence he was witnessing wasn't weakness. It was calculation. Felix's phone buzzed faintly in his hoodie pocket, but he ignored it. His fingers tightened on the armrest. He had always been taught to respect others, especially strangers. His father, a federal judge, had drilled it into him since childhood. "How you treat those with no power says everything about who you are," Judge Drawn would say. Chandler clearly hadn't learned that lesson. Chandler passed Jace again on his return trip down the aisle. "We good back here, big guy?" he said, pausing theatrically beside him. "Need a parachute or just the window seat to look tough?" His smile was wide, but his eyes didn't hold warmth. Just control. Power. Jace slowly turned his head this time, not sharply, not defensively, just a smooth movement, like a hinge well-oiled. He looked at Chandler's reflection in the overhead bin, not directly at him, and said nothing. His silence was a mirror, and Chandler didn't like what stared back. From the front of the cabin, a man in 2A lowered his noise-canceling headphones just an inch. Corwin Slate adjusted his cufflink with precision, but his attention was no longer on his digital briefing. His eyes locked onto the scene unfolding in Coach, quiet but sharp like a knife unsheathed under velvet. He knew that face. Not from a magazine, not from a meeting. From a file. A file stamped highly restricted, buried beneath a maze of clearance codes and security layers inside the Department of National Security's internal threat matrix. Jace Ryland, former lieutenant commander, confirmed combat survivor, medals received, 7, confirmed kills, classified, mental state, stable, with extraordinary restraint. Last known operation, Echo Ridge, black file. Corwin's fingers stopped moving. His mouth tightened. He'd read Jace's file twice, not because of suspicion, but because Jace represented a rare type, a man who had walked through fire without letting it burn him bitter, a man whose name showed up on only one kind of list, the kind kept in vaults. And now that man was being taunted by a flight attendant with a microphone and a fragile ego. Corwin kept watching. He didn't move yet. It wasn't time. Back in row 35, Felix couldn't sit still. He kept peeking between the seats. He watched Jace's breathing, steady, his posture unthreatening, but there was something electric in the air, like a calm before thunder, a stillness that didn't belong. Felix fumbled for his phone and opened his messages. He typed, "There's a man in front of me. I think he's a soldier, and someone keeps mocking him." Then he added, "I don't know why, but I feel like something big's about to happen." He hit send. The message zipped away, landing in a secure inbox attached to Judge Drawn's encrypted network. Felix didn't know it, but that one text triggered a keyword flag. Soldier plus threat. Within moments, automated systems marked it as a potential incident. Jace, meanwhile, closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, his gaze calm but alert. He wasn't annoyed, he wasn't flustered, but in his mind, the scenario had already been broken down like a combat simulation. Threat level, low. Agitator, male, mid-30s, insecure, power-seeking. Audience, civilian. Innocence. Rules of engagement. Don't escalate. Don't entertain. Maintain control. But even Jace knew that control had its limits, and it wasn't always up to him when the line got crossed. Chandler's voice came again, this time softer, as he bent slightly toward Jace with a fake grin. "I'm just playing, man," he said with mock sincerity. "You know, lighten the mood. You look like you've seen a ghost." Jace didn't look at him. He whispered just loud enough, his voice gravel on stone. "I've seen worse." And that was it. Chandler blinked, confused. "What?" But Jace had already turned back, his body still, eyes ahead. Corwin leaned forward in his seat. He made no move toward the cockpit. Not yet, but his fingers hovered over the emergency secure input device embedded in his leather briefcase. He tapped in a code that triggered a silent monitor of the onboard activity logs. Not because Jace was dangerous, because someone else might be. "Slate to control," he typed into the secure channel. "Passenger 34B identified. Recommend passive watch. Situation unfolding. Civilian interference. Potential provocation." Observing, he hit send. In the row behind Jace, Felix watched everything, every shift in breath, every glance, every insult. And somewhere deep in the boy's chest, admiration began to form. Not the kind built on explosions and action scenes, but on poise, on dignity. He didn't understand it yet, but he would. And Chandler, he had no idea that the next time he opened his mouth would be the last time it came without consequences. The wrong man is being tested, and the test is about to snap. Just after takeoff, the cabin had settled into that quiet lull that always followed the roar of ascent. Trays clinked in the galley, seatbelt signs still glowed overhead, and flight attendants began their routine. Jace Ryland, seated in 34B by the window, kept to himself. He stared out at the clouds, his right arm resting on the armrest, fingers absently tracing the edge of his seat. He didn't hear Chandler Vex approaching from behind, at least, not until the sharp edge of the beverage cart rammed into his elbow with surprising force. The scalding splash of coffee came next, staining his sleeve and sending a jolt of heat through his nerves. "Careful there, Rambo," Chandler said casually, already pushing the cart past him with a smirk. He didn't even look back. The cabin didn't fall silent, but it slowed. Conversations paused. Heads turned. A couple seated nearby exchanged uneasy glances. A child across the aisle stared, wide-eyed. And in row 35, Felix Drawn leaned forward, his breath caught in his throat. Even Corwin Slate in 2A shifted in his seat, one hand pausing on the volume dial of his noise-canceling headphones. Jace didn't react right away. He didn't shout, didn't rise in fury. Instead, he slowly stood, one fluid motion from years of discipline. The gray hoodie came off in a single pull, revealing a black undershirt stretched across a broad, muscular frame, lean but solid. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't his build. It was the scar. It traced down from his left shoulder, cutting diagonally across the muscle like a lightning strike carved in flesh. Jagged, deep, old. A scar earned, not from accidents or surgery, but something much darker, something battlefield-born. Gasps rippled across the nearby rows, the kind that slipped from lips before the mind could even catch them. One man in 36C sat up straighter, blinking in disbelief. An elderly gentleman across the aisle put down his crossword. Chandler, finally noticing the shift in attention, turned and saw what the silence had gathered around. His smirk faltered. "What's that supposed to mean?" Chandler asked, trying to play it off, but his voice carried an edge now, a hint of uncertainty. Jace didn't move closer. He didn't need to. He stood calmly, the coffee stain drying on his sleeve, his posture unreadable. "It means," Jace said, voice low and even, "you're too loud for someone who knows so little." The words hit like a dropped weight, cold, direct, the kind that didn't need yelling to hurt. Chandler blinked, still trying to regain footing. "Excuse me?" Jace didn't blink, didn't flinch. His gaze locked on Chandler's like a sniper sighting his target. No threat, just precision. "You've been joking with a man trained to clear buildings faster than you serve drinks." The air left the cabin like someone had flipped a switch. Chandler's mouth opened, but no words came out. The passengers who had laughed earlier now looked down at their phones or trays. Some squirmed in their seats. A man behind Felix adjusted his neck pillow like it could shield him from the tension. The silence was no longer awkward. It was reverent. Felix's heart pounded. He'd never seen anything like this. Not on TV, not in movies, not in real life. This wasn't some outburst or dramatic fight. This was control, calculated, cold, and rooted in something terrifyingly real. And it wasn't overreacting. It was restraint. Chandler gave a nervous laugh, stepping back slightly. "Hey, man, it was just a joke." But the joke had landed like a grenade, without laughter, and now the shrapnel was truth. Corwin Slate sat upright in 2A, no longer pretending to ignore what was happening. His eyes narrowed, studying Jace, the scar, the stance, the reaction. He recognized the signs, not just of someone who had seen war, but someone who had survived it by staying calm when bullets flew. The man in coach wasn't dangerous. He was dangerous only if needed, and that made him more valuable than anyone on this plane could guess. Chandler, desperate to save face, cleared his throat and looked around. "All right, folks, let's move on. Snack service coming up." But no one responded. No one smiled. Even Declan, the other flight attendant, avoided his eyes. The power in the cabin had shifted. It didn't belong to Chandler anymore. Jace sat back down, slowly pulling his hoodie over the scar without a word, his breathing steady, his face unreadable. The clouds outside drifted by, white and indifferent. No applause followed, no dramatic soundtrack swelled. But in that moment, the plane had shifted course, not in direction, but in tone. Because sometimes a man doesn't need to raise his voice to silence a room. Sometimes his stillness is the warning, and Jace Ryland had just issued his first. When silence speaks, the arrogant start to listen. The moment Jace sat back down in seat 34B, the temperature in the cabin shifted. Not literally, no vent had been adjusted, but something subtle and electric pulsed in the air. Chandler Vex's pride was wounded, and for a man who built his confidence on dominance over the powerless, that wound stung deeper than he'd admit. He didn't storm off. He didn't shout. He retreated with the stiffness of a man pretending to walk away by choice, not by defeat. Inside the galley, tucked behind the service curtain, Chandler's jaw clenched so tight his temple pulsed. He exhaled sharply, pulling off a disposable glove and tossing it hard into the waste bin. The hum of the aircraft was louder here, almost enough to drown his muttered words. "I'm telling you, Declan," he hissed, his voice low and fast. "He threatened me." Declan Rowe, the younger of the two flight attendants on duty, blinked. He was mid-swipe on a handheld tablet, preparing the beverage inventory. "Threatened you how?" he asked, not out of doubt but hesitation. Chandler leaned in, lowering his voice even more. Said something about clearing buildings, combat zones. He's military, man. probably unstable. Declan raised an eyebrow. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move. Just sat there. Chandler shot him a glare. You weren't standing there, Declan. You didn't see his eyes. Declan hesitated. Still, if we report this and he's not a threat, it's for documentation, Chandler interrupted, just in case. Declan gave a slow nod, uneasy but compliant. All right, I'll log it in the crew incident file unseen by either of them. Across the aisle in seat 2A, Corwin Slate had already anticipated this move. His face remained calm, but his fingers danced over the glass surface of what looked like an ordinary tablet. In reality, it was a custom secure device, transmitting data through an encrypted frequency to the National Tactical Oversight Bureau's satellite node. His field report was brief, but loaded with weight. Subject Ryland exhibiting extreme restraint under continued provocation. Civilian crew unaware of his clearance level. Risk of escalation rising due to internal crew mishandling. He paused, then added a new line. Recommend flagging for situational review. Meanwhile, in row 35, Felix Strawn held his phone tight in both hands. The boy had barely moved since the last incident. Every time Chandler passed, he held his breath. Now, hiding his phone under the tray table, he typed a short message to his father. There's a soldier on my plane. I think he's a hero. But this worker keeps mocking him. He hit send without thinking twice. The message bounced through a chain of encrypted networks, one of them monitored by the Judiciary's Federal Oversight Team. Felix didn't know that. All he knew was that something felt wrong, and the quiet man in front of him didn't deserve it. Back in seat 34B, Jace Ryland reached into the side of his duffel bag. He moved slowly, methodically. Passengers nearby watched with vague curiosity, unsure whether to fear or respect him. What he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a notebook, old, soft-covered, and worn at the edges. The cover read, in faded black ink, Unit 9, Fallen but not forgotten. He opened it with reverence, turning to the first page. A list of names. 27 of them. All men. All lost in places that never made the news. He ran his finger down the list, stopping at the fourth name. Ben Dorn. Black Sand. Door breach. No return. His thoughts darkened briefly, not with anger, but memory. He didn't come here for war. He didn't come here for respect. But when a man mocks the sacrifice of brothers, when he turns service into a punchline, then silence becomes the sharpest weapon. He closed the notebook gently, tucking it back into his bag like a sacred text. 3 rows ahead, Corwin adjusted his seatbelt and looked again toward Jace. He knew that calm. Knew it from dossiers, from field interviews, from post-action reports where survivors described a man who never raised his voice but always made it home. What worried Corwin now wasn't the threat of violence. It was the threat of misunderstanding. What happened when the wrong people poked the wrong bear? In the galley, Chandler continued pacing. He peered down the aisle with narrowed eyes. He's watching me, he muttered. Declan didn't respond. His attention was elsewhere, on the passenger. He opened his eyes again, laser-focused now. He wasn't planning retaliation. He was preparing for response. Tactical analysis ran like instinct through his brain. If something went wrong, where were the exits? Who could be trampled in panic? What was the risk of intervention versus restraint? He glanced once toward the cockpit, then toward the forward galley where Chandler had disappeared again. Let him write his report, Jace thought. Let them dig their hole. Because when the call came, and it would, someone higher up would read Felix's message. Someone would see Corwin's flagged dispatch. And when they pieced it together, they'd realize what Chandler had almost set in motion. A war he wouldn't survive, not because of fists or fire, but because of truth. Jace leaned back in his seat and let the silence do its work. Sometimes the loudest man in the room is the least prepared for silence. The plane jolted violently, a deep groan rolling through the fuselage as sudden turbulence ripped across Monarch Flight 917. Overhead compartments rattled. A sharp metallic ping echoed, followed by the mechanical hiss of oxygen masks dropping like pale ghosts from above. A collective gasp filled the cabin. In the galley, the crash was instant. Chandler Vex, mid-step and carrying a half-filled tray of drinks, lost his balance as the plane dipped again. His feet slipped on the slick floor, and he landed hard with a sharp crack of bone against linoleum. A strangled yell tore from his throat as he crumpled in a heap. Trays clattered, a juice box exploded, and a box cutter skittered across the aisle like a rogue blade. Passengers screamed. One woman clutched her chest. Others froze, wide-eyed. Declan Rowe, the other flight attendant, rushed forward but stumbled, unsure of what to do. No one moved beyond staring, except Jace Ryland. Before his brain finished calculating, his body was already in motion. 3 swift strides, controlled and precise. He dropped to one knee beside Chandler, already assessing the damage. The angle of the ankle was off. Swollen, twisted. The joint had been partially dislocated on impact. "Don't move," Jace said calmly, his voice cutting through the noise like steel through fog. Chandler's lips trembled. Sweat clung to his brow. I think it's broken," he muttered, blinking through pain. Jace ignored the panic. He reached into the emergency cabinet, pulled free 2 elastic cords from a defibrillator kit, and with surgical precision began stabilizing the ankle. The cabin air was thick with tension, passengers craning their necks to see. "You'll feel it snap back," Jace said. "Count to 3. Chandler nodded shakily. 1. Snap. A sharp pop followed. Chandler's eyes went wide as a guttural sound burst from his chest. Not quite a scream, not quite silence. Pain gave way to stunned awe. The entire section around them fell deathly still. Breathing heavily, Chandler glanced up, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were in the military?" Jace didn't answer, not with words. He looked down once to confirm the joint was in place, then stood, calmly rolled his sleeves back over the faint blood speck on his wrist, and walked back to his seat without another word. The crowd of onlookers remained frozen. Behind him, Corwin Slate lowered his device and watched. His eyes followed Jace like a scientist observing something rare and dangerous. A man with lethal training, who chose healing over harm. That mattered. Declan stood speechless, holding a useless medkit in one hand. Felix Drawn from the row behind slowly clapped. Just once, then again. Quietly, almost reverently. The sound echoed through the hushed cabin like a bell in a chapel. One by one, others joined, soft applause rising, uncertain but sincere. Jace didn't turn to acknowledge it. He simply sat back down, buckled his belt, and returned to staring out the window as if the moment hadn't just happened, as if he hadn't just mended the same man who humiliated him an hour ago. Not for praise, not for revenge, because it was the right thing to do. And in that moment, every man in the room saw the difference between power and strength. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned, usually by the one least interested in applause. The plane door hissed open as the jet bridge connected, and the usual click of heels and chatter of disembarking passengers never came. Instead, boots. 2 of them, black, polished, and belonging to a man who wasn't part of the ground crew. He stepped aboard swiftly, silently, no smile, no clipboard, just a black windbreaker and the kind of posture that said he was here for something serious. His eyes scanned the cabin like radar, then locked on Jace Ryland. "Commander," he said low, his voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the engines powering down. Jace turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "No," he replied simply, his voice steady. "Not me." He nodded once toward the galley, where Chandler Vex stood half-concealed behind a metal partition, nervously watching the exchange like a child hiding behind curtains. The man in the windbreaker blinked once, then turned. "Mr. Vex," he called firmly, stepping forward. Chandler stiffened. "Yeah?" "You're being asked to step aside for a moment." Chandler furrowed his brow. "Me? Why?" The man's tone remained calm, but it had an edge that cut through the air like a blade. "Sir, you just insulted, provoked, and attempted to formally report a decorated operative operating under deep-profile clearance. We're not here to arrest you," he said, glancing briefly at the other passengers whose ears now strained to hear. "We're here because you just became a national embarrassment." On record, Chandler's throat visibly tightened. His voice cracked. I didn't know who he was." "That," came another voice from the forward cabin, "is exactly the problem." Every passenger near the front turned. Corwin Slate emerged from row 2A, no longer the quiet, observant man with noise-canceling headphones. His blazer was now unbuttoned, revealing a badge clipped to his belt, National Tactical Oversight Bureau, Deputy Director. He approached slowly, methodically, as if every step had weight. Corwin held a thick, sealed folder in one hand. When he reached Chandler, he extended it without a word. Chandler hesitated, then took it and opened the flap with trembling fingers. Inside were photographs, Dozens. Jace Ryland in full Navy SEAL combat gear. Him rappelling down walls, dragging wounded comrades, leading operations under night sky halos. There were medals, commendations, a citation signed by a top-ranking official for actions performed during Operation Black Sand. Chandler's mouth opened, then shut again. His cheeks lost all color. Around him, a few passengers gasped as they recognized the gravity of what they were seeing. The man who had just treated Jace like dirt was now facing a truth that towered over him. Corwin's voice was calm, but firm. "You mocked a man trained to save lives. He saved yours." "And you laughed." Chandler swallowed hard. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Corwin interrupted. The silence that followed felt like vacuum. Then Corwin stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Chandler and maybe Jace could hear. "Per internal protocol," he said, "you now owe him a salute." It wasn't a request, it wasn't a demand, either. It was a reckoning. Chandler's hand twitched, his shoulders sagged. For a moment he looked like a balloon slowly deflating. He turned, dazed, toward the back of the plane where Jace stood, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Corwin took a step back. His work was done. Chandler's eyes met Jace's. A moment passed. Then, with a hesitating breath, Chandler raised his hand slowly to his brow. It wasn't crisp, it wasn't textbook, but it was sincere, or as sincere as a man who had just been humbled could manage. The cabin watched in silence, not out of respect for Chandler, but for the man who'd never once demanded any of it. Jace didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply gave a short nod, a gesture that somehow felt heavier than any words could. Chandler's salute lingered in the air a second longer than it needed to. When he finally lowered his hand, he realized his legs were shaking. The man in the windbreaker stepped forward again, now more softly. "Come with me, Mr. Vex." Chandler didn't protest. He didn't even speak. He walked down the aisle like a man on the long road to understanding, the folder still clutched in his hand like a mirror he couldn't unsee. Behind him, Corwin turned to Jace and gave a subtle nod, one professional to another. No need for words. The message was clear. Jace Ryland didn't need to reclaim respect. He never lost it. And in the hearts of every passenger who had watched silently until now, something had shifted. Because on that flight, honor had walked in silence, and a man who once thought uniform gave him power just learned what real power looked like without one. Honor demands recognition, even from those who failed to see it. He thought humiliating a Navy SEAL mid-flight would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe true strength never needs to boast, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Chandler's eyes were wide, his breath uneven, and his hand trembled as it slowly rose into a salute. Across the glossy terminal floor, beyond the red security tape, Jace Ryland stood silently, tall, calm, unmoving. His gray hoodie hung slightly loose over his frame, but everything else about him was tightly controlled. Behind him, airport passengers had gathered in a scattered semicircle, their conversations stilled into whispers. Cell phones were lowered. Faces, once distracted, were now frozen in collective awe. The shift in atmosphere was so tangible it felt like even the air had gone still. Chandler didn't understand what he was doing at first. His hand had moved almost on its own, fingers straightened, palm tilted just right, the salute precise enough to surprise even himself. No one had commanded it. There were no orders barked or expectations imposed. And yet, in that moment, saluting Jace Ryland didn't feel like submission. It felt like the first honest thing Chandler had done in years. Jace didn't return the gesture. He didn't have to. He simply nodded, a small restrained dip of his head that spoke more than 1,000 speeches. His eyes locked on Chandler's just long enough for something silent to pass between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a thread of understanding. Then he turned to leave. His boots made no sound as he stepped forward. But before he reached the terminal's automatic doors, a small voice broke through the hush. "Sir!" "Wait." Jace paused, his back still to the crowd. A boy's figure wove through the line of onlookers. Felix Drown, clutching a folded piece of paper, stopped in front of him, slightly out of breath. His hands trembled, not from fear, but reverence. "I know you don't want attention," Felix said softly, "but my dad told me to give this to you. He said people like you don't wear capes, they wear scars." Jace looked down at the boy. There was no fanfare in his movement, just a quiet acceptance. He reached out, taking the folded paper between his fingers, and slowly unfolded it. Inside, written in careful block letters, were the words, "I saw everything. You changed more than just his leg. You corrected his sight." Jace's jaw tightened. He glanced at Felix, this small witness to an unseen war, and gave a single, silent nod. The boy's eyes lit up with a mixture of pride and gratitude. He stepped back, not wanting to intrude further, but clearly feeling like he had fulfilled a duty passed down from someone much higher than himself. Across the terminal, Chandler Vex stood frozen. His arm had slowly lowered, but the weight of the moment remained on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He couldn't explain the burn in his chest, the ache that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just shame. It wasn't just guilt. It was clarity, a kind of painful light flooding into a room he hadn't realized was dark. For the first time, he understood that the man he had mocked wasn't a relic of some forgotten war or a passenger beneath his notice. Jace Ryland had stood between disaster and calm more times than Chandler would ever know. And today, without raising his voice or seeking revenge, he had done something even harder. He had offered restraint, dignity, and mercy in a world that often offered none. The crowd began to murmur again, voices returning as the spell slowly broke. A few clapped quietly, unsure whether they should. Others simply watched Jace walk toward the terminal doors and disappear into the sunlight without ever looking back. Chandler didn't follow. He couldn't. Instead, he stayed rooted to the spot, surrounded by silence that no longer felt peaceful. He looked at Felix, then at the other passengers, many of whom had witnessed the entire event. He wasn't sure if they saw him as the fool now, or worse, the coward. But none of that mattered as much as the truth echoing inside his own mind. That day, Chandler Vex had saluted a man without knowing why. Now, he knew. He hadn't saluted authority. He hadn't saluted rank. He had saluted a reminder of who he once hoped to become. And, without ever raising a hand in anger, Jace Ryland had shown him the kind of strength that didn't need a uniform to be seen. Sometimes it takes a warrior's silence to defeat a fool's laughter. The video hit the internet like a flash grenade in a dark room. No build-up, no context, just 27 seconds of raw footage, a flight attendant smirking, a juice box being dropped on a passenger's tray, and the quiet power of a man with a scar tracing down his arm saying one line that echoed across the screen. "You've been joking with a man trained to clear buildings faster than you serve drinks." Within hours, the clip climbed to the top of every trending feed. It didn't matter that it was filmed from an awkward angle or that only half the words were clear. The internet filled in the blanks with speculation, reverence, and outrage. Comment sections overflowed. "That's a Navy SEAL, right? He didn't even raise his voice. That's the scariest kind of calm. Who lets someone like that be mocked on a flight?" Veterans reposted it with tears in their captions. Military families flooded message boards with stories of their own silent heroes. Even lawmakers chimed in, demanding answers. Monarch Airlines found itself in the middle of a storm it hadn't prepared for, and Chandler Vex, once so smug and untouchable, was now frozen in the eye of that hurricane. The airline's statement came 12 hours later, bland and scripted. "We regret any discomfort experienced by our passengers and are investigating the matter thoroughly." But the public wasn't buying it. By the following morning, Chandler sat alone in a dimly lit HR office at Monarch's Central Operations Building. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer toner. A small fan rotated lazily on the desk, doing little to chase away the tension that thickened the room. He stared at a muted screen playing SEAL training footage, black and white clips of men dragging injured comrades through mud, rappelling down burning structures, diving into ice-cold waters with rifles clenched in their teeth. Sweat trickled down Chandler's temple as he watched a drill sergeant bark at a soldier who just kept moving, blood streaking down his leg, unflinching. He leaned forward and paused the screen. There, in grainy focus, was the same man he had handed the apple juice box to. Not in a hoodie, not in 34B, but in combat gear, face streaked with dirt, eyes sharp enough to cut steel. "Who is he, really?" Chandler whispered to himself, voice trembling. Across town, in a building with no signage and windows that reflected nothing but sky, Jace Ryland sat across from a man in a black suit. The room was clean, almost surgical. White walls, one table, two chairs, and a single steel folder lying between them. Corwin Slate leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. His eyes studied Jace not with suspicion but with curiosity, respect, calculation. "We've been watching you," he said finally, voice low, measured. Jace's jaw tightened. His hoodie sleeves were rolled up just slightly, the scar on his forearm still catching the fluorescent light. He didn't speak. "Not because you're a threat," Corwin added, tapping the folder, "but because we need men like you. Not in war zones. Here, in plain sight." Jace's eyes flicked toward the folder but didn't move to touch it. "I left that life behind. I have no interest in returning to it," he said quietly. Corwin nodded, then slowly slid the folder across the table. Embossed in faint black ink were the words, Operation Nightroot. He didn't push it further, he didn't sell it. He simply said, "Then why did you reset the leg of the man who humiliated you?" Jace's fingers twitched, just slightly, but he gave no answer. Corwin's voice softened. "You didn't do it for him. You didn't do it for show. You did it because that's who you are. Because when the time came, you didn't react with ego. You responded with training. With character." The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. It was filled with something unspoken. Jace finally looked up. His expression wasn't angry. It was tired. Not from the flight, but from the weight of expectations that never seemed to leave him. "You said you've been watching me," he said. "Then you already know I'm not the same man I used to be." Corwin leaned forward. "Exactly. That's why you're the one we need." The two men sat there, the folder resting between them like a bridge that hadn't been crossed yet. Back at Monarch Airlines, Chandler remained seated in the HR office, unaware of what was happening in that secure room. An HR representative, a nervous man with thick glasses and a clipboard, entered the room, cleared his throat and said, "You're suspended pending investigation." "The footage, it's out. The company is taking major heat." Chandler didn't argue, didn't complain. He didn't even ask if he'd get his job back. He just stared at the paused video frame still glowing on the monitor, the war paint, the patch on the shoulder, the eyes that had seen more than any man should. He muttered softly, "I thought I was in control of the cabin." His voice was hollow now, the arrogance stripped away. "I thought I knew what power looked like." No one responded. Somewhere else in the building, the PR department scrambled over what phrases to include in the next press release. Legal was holding emergency calls. A junior staffer whispered into her headset, "Should we mention the SEAL connection officially or not?" But outside those walls, the damage was already done, and the shift had already begun. In a world where everyone shouted to be heard, the quiet man in seat 34B had shown what true strength looked like. When the truth finally lands, some men realized they were never in control of the cockpit. 3 weeks after the flight, Jace Ryland sat in the quiet of his small apartment, the morning sun bleeding through half-closed blinds. A manila envelope lay unopened on his kitchen table. The sender's name, Judge Braden Drawn, was typed neatly in the corner. Jace stared at it for a long moment, fingertips brushing the edge like it might bite. He didn't open it right away. Letters came with weight, and this one had traveled with the silence of something important. When he finally slid a finger beneath the seal and unfolded the page, the handwriting struck him first. Firm strokes, deliberate, the kind of penmanship that didn't shake even under pressure. "You taught my son something I never could," it began. "What real strength looks like." Jace exhaled, slow and low. The words weren't about medals, weapons, or missions. They were about impact. Felix, the jittery boy in the row behind him, had started volunteering at a veterans shelter in Eastwall. The judge's letter included a photo. Felix, kneeling beside an aging veteran in a wheelchair, both of them smiling. The boy's expression had changed. It held purpose now, not nerves. That photo said more than the letter ever could. Across the room, Jace's duffel sat in the corner, unopened since the day he landed. He hadn't unpacked, hadn't needed to. The hoodie still smelled faintly of airline cabin and old leather. He closed the envelope and stared out the window. Monarch Airlines had made headlines again, but this time for a different reason. News anchors, veteran groups, and even national ethics boards had taken notice of a new internal program sweeping through the airline's training division. The Ryland Protocol, they called it, a mandatory respect and de-escalation initiative modeled on an incident involving a retired operative whose calm prevented a larger tragedy. They never named him. They didn't need to. The silhouette in the training video's thumbnail, the gray hoodie, the quiet stance, was enough. It should have felt satisfying, but to Jace, it only felt strange. His name wasn't supposed to be on training manuals. He had spent a career working from the shadows, not shaping corporate culture. Still, it stirred something. Not pride, something older, a sense that silence, even after all these years, still had weight. His phone buzzed, a single message, unknown number. Coffee? Danner's on 6th. Noon, CS. He knew who it was. Corwin Slate didn't need introductions. At exactly noon, Jace stepped into Danner's diner, a small corner joint with cracked leather booths and the smell of burnt toast lingering in the air. It was the kind of place you came to vanish in conversation. Corwin was already there, seated at the far booth, tie loosened, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug. "Thought you'd ignore the message," Corwin said as Jace slid in across from him. "I almost did," Jace replied, his voice low, unreadable. "But then I remembered who sent it." Corwin studied him for a moment, the silence thick between them. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You've been on every watch list that matters. Not because you're a threat, but because people remember who you are and what you've done. I didn't do anything on that flight except not react." Corwin shook his head. "Exactly. That's what made it matter. You had every reason to retaliate, but you didn't. You stabilized a man who mocked you. You walked away from applause. That kind of discipline, it's rare. It's valuable." Jace frowned. "If this is a recruitment pitch, I told you. I'm not here to fight anymore." Corwin smiled faintly. "Then fight for those who still can't." The words landed with weight. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, growing faint as it moved through the city. Jace glanced at the world beyond the window, people walking by, unaware that anything of importance was happening inside this little diner. That's how it always was. The big moments didn't announce themselves. They crept in quietly, dressed as conversations over bitter coffee. "I didn't ask for this," Jace murmured, his thumb tracing the edge of his mug. "No," Corwin said, "but neither did the ones who'll benefit from it." Jace said nothing. His gaze fell to the tabletop, scratched and stained by years of other people's stories. He thought of Felix, of that letter, of Chandler's wide-eyed silence at the terminal. He thought of the 27 names in his notebook, men who never got a chance to change anything. Maybe he had left the battlefield, but maybe the mission had followed. He nodded once, slowly. "I'll think about it." Corwin tapped the side of his mug with a coin before rising. "That's all I need." As the agent left, Jace remained seated, eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. His reflection in the diner window looked the same, but something inside had shifted. Not a roar, just a steady movement, a recalibration. Outside, the city moved on. Planes took off, lives intersected, and somewhere, someone like Felix sat wondering who they could become. And in that quiet moment, Jace finally understood. Some wars are no longer fought with rifles, but with reminders of what respect really means. Chandler Vex stood at the front of the training room, the glow of the projector casting pale light across his face. He looked different now, thinner, quieter, the smirk that once lived permanently on his lips long gone. Rows of young recruits, fresh-faced, sharp-dressed flight attendants in training, stared back at him. Some leaned back with crossed arms, others scrolled silently through their tablets, but all of them carried the same expression Chandler once did, amused disinterest. He cleared his throat, clicked a remote, and a freeze frame appeared on the wall behind him, a still from the now infamous in-flight video. In the image, a man in a gray hoodie stood calmly while a flight attendant smirked beside him. No one in the photo was laughing anymore. "I was that man," Chandler began, his voice steady but low. "Not the quiet one. The other one. The fool." A few heads lifted. He scanned the room slowly. "I laughed at someone I didn't understand. I mocked a man I should have thanked. And, in the end," he paused, holding their eyes, "I saluted him without knowing why." He let the words hang in the air. The silence was heavier than resistance. Someone coughed in the back. Another adjusted his badge. No one laughed. After the session ended, Chandler returned to his office, a small corner unit repurposed from an old equipment closet. His desk was clutter-free, save for a worn training manual, a thermos of lukewarm coffee, and a sticky note with a quote he read daily. "Power doesn't reveal character. Pressure does." He rubbed his eyes. Another class done. Another day spent trying to undo what he once so carelessly encouraged. But it mattered now. It had to. Every time he saw that video, heard the sharp intake of breath from a passenger when Jace Ryland revealed the scar, or watched the way he reset Chandler's ankle without a word, he remembered the lesson he had paid dearly to learn. That evening, as the sun dipped below the airport's outer tarmac, Chandler unlocked his mailbox and found a small envelope inside. No name, no return address. The paper was thick, cream-colored, with a single fold. He opened it carefully, the envelope whispering softly in his fingers. Inside was a juice box, a children's apple juice carton, the same kind he had once handed out in mockery, thinking he was clever. Alongside it was a note, handwritten in clean, confident script. Still my favorite drink. Jay Chandler's breath caught. He sat down on the concrete step outside the training wing, staring at the note. The sky above was streaked with fading gold and blue, the last planes of the day roaring overhead. But the world around him felt quiet. He held the juice box in his hands like a relic, like something sacred. A peace offering. Number. A reminder. A symbol of grace. Chandler remembered the way Jace had looked at him. Not with hatred, not even with pity, but with a calm resolve that stripped away pride. He had saved Chandler's leg, saved his reputation from spiraling into disgrace. And now, he'd sent a cartoon juice box. Somehow it felt heavier than any punishment. The door behind him creaked open. Curtis, one of the newer trainers, leaned out. "Hey, you all right?" Chandler stood, pocketing the note. "Yeah," he replied. "I just got a message from an old teacher." Curtis frowned. "Didn't know you were still in touch with any." "I wasn't," Chandler said softly. "Not until today." Back inside, he placed the juice box on a shelf above his desk, right next to the projector remote. That would be the first slide tomorrow. No more video. Just the juice box and the story behind it. Because sometimes a lesson didn't need to be loud. It needed to be remembered. And in that moment, Chandler Vex didn't feel like a joke anymore. He felt like a man rebuilding brick by brick what he once helped tear down. Some men break others with words. The rare few rebuild them with silence. Jace Ryland slipped into the back row of the low-lit auditorium just as the overhead lights dimmed and the large screen at the front faded to black. The title slide vanished, replaced by a simple logo. Quiet Valor, stories behind the uniform. No music, no dramatic fanfare. Just silence, the kind Jace appreciated more than most. He took a seat at the edge of the row, pulling the brim of his cap lower over his eyes. His gray hoodie looked out of place among the clean-cut suits, medals, and polished shoes surrounding him. But no one stopped him. No one recognized him. That was how he preferred it. The summit had been organized by Judge Braden Drown, the same federal judge whose teenage son had sat behind Jace on Monarch Flight 917, the same son who had sent a quiet ripple through Jace's otherwise still life. Jace hadn't planned on coming. When the invitation arrived, he tossed it aside, but something shifted when he learned Felix was scheduled to speak. It wasn't obligation that brought him here. It was curiosity and something else, something harder to name. A young announcer stepped to the podium at the front of the stage, his voice calm but firm. "Our next speaker is a young man who saw something many overlook." Please welcome Felix Drawn Jace felt the subtle shift in the room as polite applause began. His eyes narrowed slightly. He remembered the boy clearly. Nervous hands, wide eyes, the kind that watched everything but said nothing. Now, the same boy walked onto a stage lit by a single soft spotlight. Felix wore a navy blazer that didn't quite fit his shoulders, a tie slightly crooked, and a badge clipped to his chest labeled Youth Advocate, Civilian Partner. He reached the podium and adjusted the microphone. His voice cracked slightly, but he caught himself. "Good evening," he began, clearing his throat. "A few months ago, I was on a flight to Eastwall City. I was traveling alone, scared, and not really sure how to act in public yet. I thought I'd just put in my earbuds and forget the world." He paused, looking down at his note cards. Then he set them aside. "But I watched something that day that I'll never forget. I watched a man get laughed at, not for being rude, not for doing anything wrong, but just for being quiet, for minding his own business, for existing." A soft murmur moved through the room. Jace stayed still, his fingers laced together tightly in his lap. He could feel his pulse in his wrist, steady but heavy. Felix continued. The person mocking him thought he was being funny. But the moment things went wrong on that plane, when the drink spilled, when someone got hurt, when there was panic, that same quiet man stood up and helped. No hesitation, no drama, just calm, practiced hands. From the front row, Judge Drawn nodded. In the second row, Corwin Slate sat with arms folded, lips pressed into a proud smirk. Felix drew a breath. He didn't shout. He didn't scold anyone. He didn't even defend himself when people made fun of him. But what he did do was show me what real strength looks like. Not in his muscles, not in his medals. I didn't even know he had those. But in how he carried pain like it was just another bag over his shoulder, and how he handled disrespect without losing a shred of his dignity. Jace shifted slightly in his seat, eyes fixed on the floor now. The weight of the boy's words pressed harder than he expected. I saw him fix someone's dislocated leg like it was nothing. But what I realized later, Felix said, scanning the audience, was that he did more than fix a leg. He fixed me. His voice cracked again, this time not from nerves, but from emotion. That flight made me rethink what manhood means. It's not about volume or dominance. It's about self-control. About protecting even when no one says thank you. It's about stepping up quietly when others step back loudly. A hush fell across the room. Felix looked out at the sea of faces, searching. He didn't tell me his name. But I found it later. And when I did, I realized something. Legacy isn't about medals. It's not even about stories people write about you. It's about moments. Moments people carry forward long after the man himself has disappeared into a crowd. In the shadows, Jace's jaw clenched. He stared ahead, unmoving. The applause that followed was not loud, but it was sincere. A rising swell of hands clapping in quiet rhythm. Corwin stood. So did Judge Drawn. Others followed. Felix stepped down from the stage, his eyes darting to the back rows. And for a second, just a flicker, he spotted the man in the gray hoodie. He gave a small nod. Jace returned it, barely tilting his head. But in that single exchange, something passed between them. Not recognition, not admiration, acknowledgement. As the lights shifted and the next speaker prepared to take the stage, Jace stood slowly and turned toward the exit. The hallway outside was empty, lined with photo displays of uniformed men, some alive, some fallen. He paused beside one. A black and white image of a younger soldier, nameless. No plaque, no story, only a caption. He spoke little, but he saved many. Jace didn't smile, but something softened behind his eyes. He touched the edge of the frame, then continued walking. Behind him, the door to the auditorium slowly closed. And in that final silence, as the echo of clapping faded into stillness, Jace Ryland felt for the first time in years that the war inside him had briefly gone quiet. Legacy isn't built from medals. It's etched in moments others remember long after we forget, Lieutenant Commander. The voice cut through the fading noise outside the summit building like a ripple across still water. Jace Ryland stopped mid-step, his boots grinding softly against the gravel walkway. He didn't turn immediately. The weight of that title, Lieutenant Commander, still felt like a uniform he'd taken off long ago but could never quite put away. Slowly, he turned. It was Chandler Vex. But the man before him now was a shadow of the one who had strutted down airplane aisles with smug confidence and quick insults. There was no tailored vest or polished shoes, just jeans, a plain shirt, and eyes stripped bare of arrogance. The smirk was gone. In its place stood something far more difficult to wear: humility. "I owe you more than a salute," Chandler said, stepping forward, extending his hand. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from the awkward gravity of accountability. Jace studied him silently for a moment. The man's shoulders, once squared with false authority, were now slightly hunched, as if carrying something heavier than luggage. Guilt. Growth. "I owe you a mirror," Chandler added, his gaze steady but uncertain, like a student unsure if the answer he's giving will be accepted. Jace finally took the hand, firm but measured. The grip wasn't about dominance. It was about recognition. "You owed yourself that," Jace replied, his tone even, neither forgiving nor condemning, just honest. Behind Chandler stood a small cluster of young men, all flight attendant trainees. Wide-eyed, nervous, and trying hard not to appear as if they were listening in, they hovered like satellites around a new planet. One of them adjusted his name tag. Another clutched a training manual too tightly. Chandler glanced back at them, then at Jace. "I teach them now," he said, his voice quieter. "Not because I deserve to, but because I understand what happens when you don't." His confession hung in the air for a moment, raw and unguarded. There was no punchline this time, no sarcasm, just the aching realization of the damage one man's ignorance could cause. Jace nodded once. Then teach them well. He turned to leave, his gray hoodie folding gently against the early evening breeze. The sky above the summit building glowed with streaks of amber and gold, the last traces of sunlight catching on the windows like slow-burning fire. The crowd from the event had mostly dispersed, save for a few lingering attendees chatting near parked sedans and waiting shuttles. But just as Jace reached the sidewalk's edge, Chandler's voice called after him again. "You still like those cartoon juice boxes?" There was a beat, a pause so quiet it felt rehearsed by time itself. Jace didn't turn back, but his voice rose clear above the hush. "Only if they come with a side of respect." Laughter stirred behind him, not the mocking kind, but something lighter, real. A few of the trainees chuckled awkwardly. One of them, a boy no older than 20, whispered, "That was him, wasn't it?" Another nodded silently. Chandler stood still, watching Jace disappear into the crowd, not as a disgraced worker trying to reclaim dignity, but as a man reshaped by truth. He didn't salute this time. He didn't need to. That moment had passed. What remained was something more permanent, a course correction in his life. He turned back to the group of trainees. "Come on," he said. "Lesson starts now." As they walked into the building behind him, one of the boys asked, "Do you ever think you'll see him again?" Chandler didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the door and held it for the others. "Some men walk away without applause," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "But they leave behind an echo that never fades." And the door shut quietly behind them, like the final page of a chapter still echoing in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Moments later, his laughter faded. The instinct to salute rose before he even knew why. If you stand for honoring sacrifice and protecting dignity, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of respect, hidden identities, and the unexpected recognition of service. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire empathy and appreciation for those who serve with integrity.